Hi, so we're going to be talking about The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Brianna's posting a biography, a little presentation on Simone de Beauvoir's life on the Canvas site for the course, so you can read that. If you're following along with the notes, you may notice that there are a lot of quotes in the notes for it, and I'm not gonna read a bunch of quotes in this video, but I will try to explain what she's talking about. She just put so many things so well that I couldn't resist putting a lot of quotes in there. And one thing that I think is really interesting about Simone de Beauvoir as a philosopher, she talks about how women are subordinate to men in society, and how women kind of internalize that, and in some ways are complicit in that. But in a way, she does that herself. She doesn't kind of acknowledge herself as a philosopher in her own right, but she, kind of suggests that all she is a midwife to Sartre's ideas. She's a midwife to Sartre's existentialist ethics. So to me, it's a little sad to see that she doesn't sort of give herself full credit for her own contributions. Also, I'm just going to note I have like a cat here, like a cat in my lap, like a James Bond villain here. So I don't know if she's going to be making any noise or anything like that, but just to let you know so you won't be startled. Okay, so the first question is like, what is a woman? Now, there are two poles that Beauvoir wants to avoid. Oh, and let me just make a comment about her name. Sometimes people refer to her as de Beauvoir. Sometimes people refer to her as Beauvoir. I'm going to stick with Beauvoir. I think that's more traditional in French, to drop the de when you're talking about someone's last name. But you'll probably see both various places if you look. All right. So in any case, what Beauvoir wants to do is kind of take a position between the assumption that there's some kind of sharp, stark difference between men and women, like there's an essence of womanhood or essence of the feminine, and the position that there's absolutely no difference between the sexes, because she says, like, at least at this point in time, when she's writing, this would be at the end of the 40s, you just look around you, you can see very clearly there's quite a lot of difference between the sexes in terms of their actions, in terms of how they dress, how they comport themselves, etc., their place in society, and all these other kinds of factors. So, it's not like there's no difference at all. That would be unrealistic. But what she wants to say is that the difference is largely developed through social expectations. So, we make a distinction between sex and gender. If you ever take like a gender studies class or anything like that, and say like, well, sex is biological and gender is a sort of like social role, has to do with your social role. And here, you see the sort of beginnings of this idea when Beauvoir says, you're not born a woman, but you're made a woman. Like, and not just in terms of growing to adulthood, but in terms of adopting the role that's expected of you, and kind of taking in the information about what you're supposed to be. Now, we've mentioned the concept of alterity and treating somebody as the other. And this is really important here in Beauvoir's thought. In a lot of systems of othering, what we have is a case where there's a group that's treated as the other, but it kind of goes in both directions. So if you think about on the basis of race, if someone is othered on the basis of their race, they can do the othering too. But what Beauvoir wants to say about women is it's kind of an unusual case of this. For one thing, traditionally, man is seen as the default. It's not like we're just talking about two sides of a dichotomy. A male is seen not only as the opposite of woman, but as sort of like the neutral human being, and that's reflected in just referring to humanity as man. And you've probably noticed this when we read through all these existentialists. They say sort of like man is condemned to be free, or man has no nature, and there's always this reference to what is man. And you might ask, like, is that truly neutral, or is it intended to refer specifically to men, actually, and to somewhat exclude women? And some of the readings that we've looked at, like Nietzsche, when he talks about possessing a woman or conquering a woman, it seems pretty clear he's kind of addressing himself to men. So the historical perception in society, in philosophy, in religion, etc., is that male is the default and women are sort of like a imperfect man, or a man who's missing some parts, right? So that's the underlying idea behind it. And it's also, I think, a unique status of other. When you look at like an ethnicity or a race or a religion or whatever like that, you can see that that group might have their own culture and their own history, a time, before they came under this kind of discrimination or oppression or whatever like that. But there's not a time when there was a society of women that existed and they had their own culture and everything like that, and then they were enslaved by the men. They've always lived among men, and for pretty obvious reasons. You can't have a culture that's going to persist over time that exists, that contains nothing but women, right? So they're among men, and they so oftentimes will identify more with their male spouses, their fathers, their sons, etc., than they will with women in general. So that comes up a lot when we talk about like issues like voting. Like, why is it that white women maybe vote in ways that aren't specifically targeted towards women's interests? You might say, well, they're interested in their family. How is their family going to most benefit from policies that are going to be enacted? So they might be voting in their husband's interests rather than in the interests of women in general, right? So that's part of the reason why they lack this sort of sense of unity that other groups that have been historically othered might possess. Okay. Now, you might ask the question, like, why does this othering even happen? And I think one of the things that's interesting about Beauvoir is, she talks a little bit about that. Is like, this is natural in the development of a culture, is that, and here she's citing Levi-Strauss, that as you develop a cultural identity, part of that is to consider another group as separate, as distinct. The only way that you can get a true sense of, what your own character is to put it in opposition to something else, to other someone else, okay, in comparison. And that can happen. It happens all the time, that there'll be this in-group identification and this out-group categorization. But with women, it's very striking, because for one thing, it seems like it's always been the case. There was never a time when women were in the dominant position, and as I say, women never existed separately on their own. And you might ask that as like, why is that? Some anti-feminists would argue that the fact that women have always been dominated would be like proof that women are inferior. But Beauvoir wants to get away from all of this, like, who's inferior, who's superior, are we all the same? she, again, I think like a lot of existentialists, she says, you know, we really have to consider people as individuals. To say one group is superior to another or inferior or they're just the same or whatever, that's ridiculously oversimplifying. You know, you got to take people on their own terms, and each of us are individuals. Okay, so when she's writing this, there's a development. They're starting to develop. Of course, women have got the vote in many parts of the world at that point, and they're entering into the professions to some extent. But like Beauvoir herself, you know, she was one of the only women in the intellectual circles that she dealt with, and even as the legal rights for women were increasing, the discrimination against women, the perception that women were less than, was still pretty pervasive, and I would say to some extent continues to this day. I mean, it's changed over time and it continues to change, but one point Beauvoir makes is anytime there's a sort of push for more rights for women, there's going to be a pushback as well of just like, well, women are losing their way. They're losing. Feminism is destroying the qualities that make women so great. So again, anytime there's a step forward, there's going to be some pushback as well. And I mean, I think that's pretty historically accurate. So can things change? I don't know. You know, it's like, to some extent, you might say women are in part responsible for the way that things have been, because sometimes it's easier, you know, like she talks about. It can be a relief to let go of your freedom and let somebody else make the decisions for you. We talked about that, you know, it's like in relation to the idea that we are free by compulsion or condemned to be free. Is that, you know, sometimes people want a way out. So you think of like the trophy wife or whatever like that is, okay, all she has to do is look good, and she doesn't have to make any of the decisions, and someone's going to take care of her. And that is an easy path in life, but is it a satisfactory path in life? For some people it would be. They say like, yep, I can do that. I can make that compromise. But for a lot of people, and again, especially when you're considering it from the point of view of trying to live authentically, this is going to be extremely disappointing. This is going to be like a life half lived if you're just kind of taking the easy way out. Okay, so what's the likelihood that things are going to change? And it's like, well, I mean, it's unlikely for people who are benefiting from the status quo to want to relinquish that. You know, it's more likely that they're going to want to hang on to the way that things are. And again, many men are sympathetic to women's situation, but Beauvoir wants to suggest, for one thing, you can't completely understand something if you haven't experienced it yourself. You can be very sympathetic, you can be very empathetic, you can have people who you're really close to, you can have, you know, a wife or a daughter, you know, mother, people who you care about, but you can't really understand it because you haven't experienced it, right? And that lack of understanding and that lack of desire to forego the advantages of this kind of othering is part of what maintains the situation as it is. But as I said, it's partly women as well who are not making a concerted effort to push back against this, partly because, you know, in your daily life, you might feel like I'm treated decently, you know, my colleagues treat me fine, the people I go to school with, my family members, I'm not dealing with any kind of like blatant sexism in my day-to-day life, so therefore, you know, there's nothing really to fight for. And I think there's a lot of times that, I mean, it seems like it kind of ebbs and flows in society. where like there's a push for feminism, and then there's like kind of like a more passive time where people feel like, well, everything's fine now, we don't need to push any further. And then there's a recognition like, wait, there's still, these major concerns that need to be addressed that haven't really been settled yet. And so then there's another kind of push forward. I want to read one quote here that I think captures the central point. Every time transcendence falls back into immanence, stagnation, there is a degradation of existence to the en soi. That's like the being in itself, as opposed to a being for itself. The brutish life of subjection to given conditions, and of liberty into constraint and contingence. This downfall represents a moral fault if the subject consents to it. If it is inflicted upon him, it spells frustration and oppression. In both cases, it is an absolute evil. Right? So it doesn't matter whether somebody consents to the oppression or whether the oppression is forced upon them. In both cases, that's, at least from this perspective of existentialist ethics, an absolute evil. And then also, too, I can't help but note that she does use him, the neutral him there, to refer to women, which is kind of interesting. So I want to throw out a few questions here, and we'll get a chance to talk about some of these in our discussion this week. First, is gender entirely a social construction? A lot of people push back on this idea. They want to say that, look, if you have like little boys, little girls, that they're going to naturally behave in certain ways based on their biological sex. Boys are going to like pick up, gun-like toys, and girls are going to play, tea party or whatever like that. I guess it's hard to say because we've never really had a situation where the kind of social pressures that there are on males and females haven't existed. Okay. Another question talking about this, about gender and gender norms, is how does this relate to the dictum that existence precedes essence? Now, one question I want to ask, okay, so Beauvoir was writing this, 70 years ago or so, and we might ask the question is like, how much is this still true today? Is male still seen as the default? Because even with all the significant legal gains that have occurred in terms of fighting against sex discrimination, do we see equal representation by women in positions of power, equal value placed on women's work? How do language, education, the media, and other social forces construct and maintain our understanding of gender? So what do you think about that? What are the forces in society that seem to perpetuate gender roles? And are they diminishing? Are they increasing? Are they staying stable? Okay. How, if at all, do traditional gender roles impede individual authenticity? And I think that there's so much that existentialists have had to say, not just about gender, of course, but how social constraints and social expectations in general interfere with our authenticity. Do these roles only adversely affect women? Do they adversely affect women? Now, this is a concern that I have. I would say particularly about parenting and, family dynamics. I think a lot of men have to deal with the perception that the mother is the primary caregiver, and so in terms of like custody or other issues that come up in family court, there's sometimes preference given to the mother, and you say, well, like a guy who wants to be a stay-at-home parent, it's not it's not valued in the same way that it might be if a mother chooses to be a stay-at-home parent. Okay. What about this? Going to the issue of self-deception we talked about earlier. Is it self-deception for a woman to say that her authentic self is the traditional feminine role? So let's say you're just like a super feminine woman, it's like, I like to wear high heels, like to wear makeup, I like to, be treated like a lady, and all this kind of stuff like that. Is that some kind of self-deception to kind of completely absorb that? And perceive yourself in that way. Okay. And then I just want to think about how have things changed since The Second Sex was written. Do you think that the points that she makes in this book or in this introduction are still relevant today, or do you think things have changed to the extent that this is really a concern of the past? All right, that's all I've got for today. Thanks. I'll talk to you later in the week.